another speaker from the US again who was to speak, Professor Timalsina. He is unable to join us today from San Diego because there was a pre-scheduled travel, and he could therefore not join us live. But he very much wanted to be a part of the proceedings today, and therefore he is very kindly recorded his lecture for us. So before my colleague Srinivas Garu plays the recording of Acharya Sthaneshwar Timalsina ji's recording, I would like to introduce him, and thereafter we would have Dr. Jiskowski speak. So, about Professor Sthaneshwar Timalsina. Acharya Dr. Sthaneshwar Timalsina from Nepal was traditionally trained, consecrated with Sarvadhikar, Sarva Samrajya, Diksha, and authorized as Shaivacharya with Nepali Sarvamanya order by his Diksha gurus. He was taught the Vedas, Nyaya, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Shaiva Siddhanta, Trika, Mahartha, and other Shastras in Nepal and Varanasi by the teachers as well as others such as Tanka Prasad Timalsina, Vidyanath Upadhyay, Ramananda Giriji, and others. He's also received academic and philological training in Mahendra Sanskrit University in Kathmandu and Sampurnanand Sanskrit University in Varanasi, as well as in Martin Luther University in Germany, where he acquired his PhD in classical Indian philosophy. He's currently professor of religious studies in San Diego State University, USA. He's long dedicated himself to the goal of preserving the traditions he inherited in a modern institutionalized way. First, by founding the Tantric Department of Nepal Sanskrit University in Kathmandu, then by allowing the Shastric traditions to speak as subject in the global scenario through his academic works, and finally through founding Vimarsha Foundation with the goal of preserving classical Shastric and sadhana training. As I just mentioned, that he is unable to join us today in person, but he sent us a recording, and his lecture is on Introduction to the Philosophy of Abhinavagupta. So without further ado, Srinivas Garu, could you please play the recording?
Namaskar. Thank you for inviting me to talk on Abhinavagupta. I'll do my best, but I'm telling you it is impossible to bring forth the philosophy and mysticism and aesthetics of Abhinavagupta in one single conversation. I will not go into the depth of who Abhinavagupta was, as you all already know. I will just go directly to his contribution. Abhinavagupta was an eminent philosopher, an eminent aesthetician, an eminent dramatist, a tantric, a yogi, a mystic, a polymath, and a cosmopolitan in a real sense of 11th century Kashmir. If we explore the texts such as Ishwara Pratyabhijna Vimarshini and Vivritti Vimarshini, they go beyond a mere exegetical exercise, and we see that Abhinavagupta has a deeper philosophical insight of his own that he adds on top of what he has received from his preceptors. As an aesthetician, he wrote a commentary called Lochana, the eyes, on Tantraloka, the light of Dhwani, resonance. Tantraloka is Anandavardhana's text, and Lochana, the commentary of Abhinavagupta, takes the book to its zenith. The same way, as a mystic and a tantric and a yogi, we can read his works like Sri Tantraloka, a voluminous work actually, although he claims that Natad astihaya nasti malini vijayattare, that there is nothing in the Tantraloka that doesn't exist in the Malini Vijayattara. But it's encyclopedic. He cites more than 100 original agamas, and he repeatedly cites his guru like Sambhunatha. And this is an assimilation of multiple tantric traditions like Kula, Kaula, Krama, Mahartha, and Drika, and so all these sub-schools, sub-variations that existed before the time of Abhinavagupta come to merge within his philosophy, just like all the streams and the flows merge into the ocean. He was also a poet, and you can see that in his devotional poems. And As a dramatologist, as a dramatist, you can read the Bharati commentary, Abhinava Bharati commentary in the Natya Shastra of Bharata, which actually explores so many other nuances that are not captured in Tantraloka Lochana. He is not an ordinary exegete, he is not just simple a commentator, and his originality blossoms everywhere he writes on the guise of a commentary, and you can exemplify this with two of his texts. One is the Malini Vijayavattara Vartika. I would like to single it out in some 1500 verses. This book is merely addressing the first verse, Jayanti Jagadananda, the very first verse of the Malini Vijayavattara. The same way, when we read the Paratrishika Vivarana, what we find is he's not simply reading the text as it is, he explores deeper nuances, he adds his own philosophy, he assimilates multiple different tantric traditions and Pratyabhijna philosophy within it, a Shakta Krama system, and then makes this Trika framework as an amalgamation of all the existing tantric traditions without negating any specific practice. So therefore, in Abhinavagupta, we do not find one single personality, one type of philosophy, and you can consider him as a metaphysician, as an etymologist, and so on. He has his own original epistemology, and so he has his own soteriology grounded on the framework of the Agamas. So this way, Abhinavagupta is a polymath with the broadest philosophical vision. So while Abhinavagupta writes on all these different branches of philosophy and aesthetics, he does not view that philosophical exercise is somewhat different from meditative practices. Because again, following the ethos of the Malini Vijayavattara, Tarko Yogangamuttamam, the best of the limbs of yoga is Tarka. Abhinavagupta explores to the zenith the very subtleties of logic, and when he is engaging Nyaya philosophers, and in particular the Buddhist Sautrantika Yogachara philosophers like Dharmakirti, he categorically addresses their problem, the way they raise, and then even allows to add some nuances from his part, and then he systematically demonstrates the flaws in their way of thinking. So this way, he thinks that his yogic experience, the experiences he has exalted from tantric practices, he does not like to ground merely by invoking shastras or invoking the authority of his gurus. He finds the primacy of pramana, the valid means of knowledge, and he exercises to confirm that those experiences, such as one found as identity with Shiva, can be logically grounded. So this itself you can call a consequence of philosophical reflection or a metaphysical gaze or just a mystical experience. They all come and mingle within the single personality of Abhinavagupta. What binds these apparently disparate thoughts together is his insight into freedom, because Abhinavagupta, I consider, is the first and foremost philosopher of freedom. So for him, the absolute is free in assuming the manifold. His pioneering metaphysics of dynamism, in which the absolute is intrinsically full of potential and constantly pulsating. In a sense, constantly unfolding with novelty. Rather than claiming originality for his thoughts, he cites the agamic testimonies that precede him and traces the worlds of his preceptors. New thinking for him does not come from a vacuum, and even a simple representation goes beyond being a mere copy, bearing the marks of originality. His originality does not come from creation ex nihilo, as he weaves his original ideas within the rubric of the words of his teachers and the text that he closely reads. Unlike other towering figures in the history of Hindu philosophy who worked across disciplines, Abhinava writes from the margins of the Tantric caste system, and his works underscore interdisciplinary thinking, with his writing style blending logical rigor with poetic expression. In this essay, I will not be able to address Abhinavagupta's aesthetics also because I have a shortage of time. But even then, the objective of these paragraphs that I share with you will to introduce nuances of Abhinava's thought that bridge the boundaries of Tantric mysticism and logical thought, and at the same time to bring life to some of the most unknown domains of rituals and visualizations. So, the central nuances of his cosmology involve the idea, number one, that the world is a playful expression of consciousness that is identified with Shiva or the self. Number two, materiality is as much real as the absolute form of Shiva, as this is merely his extension. And number three, the body is the mirror image of the cosmos. Number four, speech and its reference are not diametrically opposed, but rather are interwoven with the word, therefore containing the world in its seminal form. Number five, phonemes are not merely symbols for words to describe the world, but are themselves fields of energy and expression of the absolute. And finally, number six, body and mind, matter and consciousness, world and God, and all other dichotomies emerge due to ignorance or the cosmic veil imposed by Shiva or the self to maintain differentiation. For Abhinava, the entire cosmos is an extension of I am. The subjectivity that does not merge in contrast to objectivity, but as an acronym of all the phonemes that are coextensive to the totality of the manifest world. Accordingly, if our being equates with speech, our own subjectivity, aham, reflects the totality, and individuation becomes an endless mirroring of the absolute Shiva consciousness. Terms such as fullness, purnata, total I amness, purna ahanta, or the state of becoming Bhairava describe the final modes of realization wherein the absolute is equated to consciousness that is dynamic, that is constantly unfolding and folding, or that is constantly pulsating, spanda, with the manifold being the inherent nature of the singular. In Abhinava's monistic cosmology, the first dyad of Shiva and Shakti constitute a singular reality of consciousness with inherent reflexivity, and this dyad circumscribes all the other dyads of subject and object, speech and reference, consciousness and matter, mind and the body, and so on. Unique to Abhinavaguptian monism is the metaphysical foundation that the absolute is inherently dynamic and that the manifold is not erased even in the absolute singularity. In other words, one and many do not pose a dichotomy in this all-embracing totality. That is, the inherent freedom of Shiva makes possible what is otherwise impossible in constituting and sustaining difference within the singularity of Shiva, which in turn is absolute consciousness or the self, constantly pulsating and experiencing, constantly attaining novelty. Shiva's freedom exceeds a mere mirroring, as it articulates in the expression of the manifold an ever newness in every mode of manifestation. In opposition to the extremes of reductionist materialism and subjective illusionism, Abhinava presents the world as an expression or an extension of Shiva, a playful manifestation of Shiva, an embodiment of pure consciousness and being, while also accepting the manifold as real modes of becoming. That is, the reality of becoming is not subordinate to that of being. Deeply rooted on Somananda's pantheism, Abhinava adopts the model of pantheism that is centered around a foundational subjectivity or a single reality of Shiva that unfolds out of itself the wonderful diversity of our world and relates this model of cosmology with new materialism. Abhinava, of course, rejects the reductionist paradigm of inertia that explains consciousness, life, and subjective experiences, relying on emergentism. The thesis that mind and mental world are non-existent properties in matter, which inexplicably emerges from inertia. At the same time, he does not succumb to the alternative route of subjective idealism or illusionism that results either in rejection of external reality and confirmation of the singular being and consciousness, or in rejecting both the structure and its foundation, leading to absolute emptiness, shunyata of being and things. The world, for Abhinava, is not a mistaken identity, but rather an expression of the inherent potencies of the self or Shiva. The absolute, accordingly, is the resting ground for all the apparent dichotomies. Abhinava's cosmology is an elaboration upon early agamas and the works of Somananda and Utpala. For Somananda, the world and Shiva are like gold and its ornaments. That is, the manifold is not something imposed upon Shiva, but it is Shiva as it is, in its very manifest form. Somananda says, it is not a mental construction that operates as regards this universe constituting of the earth principle, etc., since the Shiva principle is formed precisely in this manner. If something is conceived of as different from what it is, then we can speak of mental construction. But is that earth, etc., conceived of different from what it is? If mental construction confirms something real, then mental construction is just a word without content. Common among the classical metaphors to describe causality include milk and yogurt, mirage, or that of rope and the snake. If the first seeks a direct correlation between the cause and the effect, the second rejects what is being projected, whereas the third, that means the rope and the snake, affirms the basis upon which something is projected. Even though the example of gold and ornaments runs parallel to that of milk and yogurt, there is real change in the chemical structure when the milk turns into yogurt. Another common metaphor is that of the ocean and its tides, describing difference on the basis of conceptualization and articulation. If similar terminology such as Maya is to be found in this paradigm, that only describes the marvelous powers inherent to the Absolute. The model of causality that Abhinava adopts is that of emergence or manifestation, abhivyakti, that is, the traits that are inherent to the cause are not expressed in their latent state, but potentials to become a plant and produce flowers and seeds are expressed when the proper conditions are met. However, a sesame, for example, does not have the potential to become an apple tree and vice versa. So there's always something intrinsically given. So Shiva, or the Absolute, on the other hand, possesses all potentials and therefore retains all the latencies in their seminal form. The Abhivyakti, the manifestation model of causality in Abhinava's paradigm, contrasts two different theories. The Sankhya model of Satkarya, for example, the concept that the effect is already in the cause, or that an effect is merely a new arrangement and not a chemical alteration. And the early Ajivaka and the materialist models that utilize the concept to affirm some forms of reductionist materialism. And this comes in dialogue with early Shaiva models and Nyaya models of causality that considers God instrumental in creation. Even though Sankhya and early Shaiva philosophies are dualistic, materiality and mutation in the Sankhya paradigm are not mediated by a transcendent agent. In the process of refining Somananda's pantheism, a new model of causality, the model of manifestation Abhivakti, enters the field, with the maxims that all the traits of what manifests are in causal form and that there is no separation between consciousness and the matter. Shiva's agency is not external to material world, as Shiva resides within everything. Rather than conforming the claims of physicalist emergentism, this new application of manifestation or emergence underscores the idea that something non-existent cannot come into being, and there must be something within the existing entities that makes it possible for consciousness to emerge. Deviating from the Sankhya understanding that materiality is an effect with a direct transformation of the gunas, whereas consciousness or purusha is mirrored, intermingled without being affected on its own in this process of materialization, the manifestation or the Abhivakti in Abhinavaguptian perspective underscores the thesis that effect and the cause are not materially distinct, for this doesn't explain the inherent traits that manifest in the effect that already exist in the cause. Most importantly, the central thesis here is that Shiva, the Absolute itself, is number one, both the instrumental and material cause, and both mind and matter, and therefore, number two, all the traits that are visible in the expressed forms are there in the seminal form in the cause. However, this is not an attempt to negate causality or to collapse effect into cause, as every event of expression introduces novelty, and every expression of being confirms the inherent freedom within the Absolute. Accordingly, the inherent traits of Shiva are recognized in the full blossoming of all aspects in the manifold modes of expression, making recognition. We are used to a dogmatic interpretation of the thesis that Shiva is pure consciousness and that the manifold worlds are expressions of materiality along the lines that consciousness is something sublime and immaterial or non-physical. On the contrary, we come closer to understanding pure consciousness and its manifold manifestations if we think of lump of clay with all the possible shapes that can be carved, the early metaphor of gold and ornaments, or the mass of consciousness as the mass of ice that melts and flows and turns into rivers and fills the lakes, and the flowing water as the manifold. Just as the singularity of the lump, gold, or of ice does not contradict the endless manifestations of possible shapes, the manifold manifestation in the world does not pose a dichotomy with the singularity of Shiva. Our accustomed causality crumbles when we engage with the cosmology of 36 principles, as there are 9 principles taught to us above time, kala, in the metaphysics through which Abhinavagupta is working. In other words, temporal manifestation collapses to make sense above the categories after the collapse of time, and so the issue of when Shiva Shakti separate doesn't refer to a temporal when. For us to explore Abhinavaguptian metaphysics as well as soteriology, we need to go to Paratrishika Vivarana. And the central concepts we can extract from there is number one, a dialogical constitution of reality, and I have worked extensively and published on this regard. Number two, phonetic expression of categories, and 3, polyvalence of what it means to be the absolute or anuttara. From Abhinava's perspective, the non-temporal dialogue between Shiva and Shakti not only constitutes our everyday reality, but also envelops the fivefold act that covers emergence to grace within this primordial dialogue. This dialogue is a metaphor for another metaphor of illumination, prakasha, and reflexivity that underscores the self-aware nature of consciousness that is not only constantly revealing the manifest entities, but also recognizing reality as it unfolds. This is not a metaphysics grounded on inertia, neither is it metaphysics based on external causation. Underscoring dynamism, there is never suspension of dialogue between Shiva and Shakti. It's not like when did they talk? I mean, are they now broke? Meaning they stop talking to each other? The dialogue of Shiva Shakti is an eternal dynamism. So Abhinavagupta says accordingly, if Shiva were to remain in a singular form without any change, he would abnegate his lordship and his essential character of pure consciousness and be like a pot. Asthasyad ekarupena vapushachen maheshwara maheshwaratam samvetam tad atyakshat ghatadivat. This primordial dialogue was beyond metaphysics and addresses epistemology, underscoring a dialogical manifestation of intentional consciousness. But moreover, this also addresses soteriology as the revelation of the words here that are in dialogue, and words embody the nature of the absolute. Yet again, creation and creator do not pose a dichotomy, even if the words and their agent expressing words are different entities. The intricate relation between word and meaning that underscores Bhartrihari's philosophy is further embellished by Abhinava with the expressed and the expression, where the meaning and the word constitute a singular body like conjoined twins whose identity is not to be collapsed to a single person, but they are not two separate entities either. All polarities of word and meaning, of matter and consciousness, of body and mind, and of teacher and disciple are subsumed upon this singular constitution of Aham or I am that stands for Shiva and Shakti, the illuminating and reflexive modes of consciousness that embodies the totality. Also central to this dialogue is the concept of relation. In both Tantraloka and Paratrishika Vivarana, Abhinava deems it necessary to outline 6 levels of relations that mediate the revelation of the Absolute, starting from the relation that seeks difference within singularity, extended all the way down to the relation that seeks unity between two manifestly different entities. Just as the transcendent para relation describes the inseparability of Shiva and Shakti, where the difference is imposed for the sake of dialogue, the 6th level dialogue at the bottom between a human teacher and a student, a non-divine relation, underscores the need for a homogeneous space between divergent subjectivities for the sake of dialogue. In all accounts, the hierarchical relation in successive layers describes the manifestation of the same absolute in lesser degrees, similar to a lamp shrouded with multiple veils. But even then, all these relations mirror the inseparability, avinabhava, between Shiva and Shakti. We need to explore further the capacity of words, particularly articulated speech. After all, this is the philosophy grounded on mantras, in constituting, not just representing reality. For mantras do not represent something, they create something. For that, we need to engage the philosophy of Bhartrihari, Kumarila and Prabhakara that provide the basis for Abhinava's understanding of the world. Taking further Bhartrihari's statement, the beginningless and endless word principle that does not change manifests vivartate in the form of meaning, wherein the process of the world begins. Abhinava equates the word with the world, and even more, finds coextension between phonemes and expressed reality. The concept of the phonetic co-extension of reality uniquely places Abhinavagupta's philosophy within the domain of mysticism, rigorously defended by sharp Nyaya logic-based epistemology. In Sanskrit, the first phoneme A and the final phoneme Ha is, if combined as an acronym, constitute Ah, And if combined with yam, which symbolically stands for the union or coming together, which Abhinava graphically depicts as banging together, samghatta, constitute aham, which translates as I or I am. And we can say Abhinavagupta's playful verse in Vimalaka Lasraya, the very first stanza in Sri Tantraloka, expressing this dichotomy coming to singularity in the birth of Abhinavagupta. Now comes the issue of grounding the absolute subject in this cosmology. And for this matter, we need to revisit the concept of the absolute or anuttara in Abhinavaguptian terms. For this context, it is not necessary for us to address all 16 etymologies of the anuttara. But what is essential, like for example, in a playful morphology that Abhinavagupta gives, and to elaborate tantric epistemology, the most salient aspects are of which there is nothing more or exceeding. Na vidyate uttaram adhikam yatra. Abhinav describes the absolute consciousness or Bhairava as the very meaning of anuttara, with all principles being dependent upon this anuttara or absolute consciousness for their confirmation. This absolute in Abhinava's paradigm transcends all the triadic structures, and including the triad of the expression of speech in the form of Pashyanti, Madhyama and Vaikhari, or that of the deities in Para, Para and Apara forms. Abhinava explains Anuttara further to elaborate upon phonetic mysticism, highlighting the transcendence of the phonemes, marked with a single drop like bindu, where it reaches to the extent of visarga, where it multiplies and it's placed like one top the other. Well, there are some crucial epistemic issues that Abhinava's monistic metaphysics invites. Some of the enduring issues, such as the gap between matter and consciousness, are already broached here. The same applies to self-manifestation of consciousness, as the central Abhinavaguptian thesis is that of consciousness inherently having the binary nature of prakasha and vimarsha, where these two aspects are subsumed within consciousness as being its twofold modes. In other words, Abhinava's paradigm inverts the mainstream philosophical positions that rest on the aforementioned chiasm in explaining how the world is given to consciousness and how the dichotomy between the self and the other is maintained so that the transaction in the world becomes possible. The challenge here is not that of how the self reaches to the other or how consciousness grabs inertia, but rather how individuation is possible and how the distinction between subject and object is grounded, so that the worldly transaction becomes possible. In other words, the epistemological challenge here is not about bridging the gap between subject and object, but rather of constituting subjectivity and objectivity in the field of singular consciousness. The categories such as manifestation, abhasa, or mirroring, pratibimba, are overused, as the same terms are exploited in the context of Yogacara Buddhism, Advaita Shankara, and also in the philosophy of Abhinavagupta. A haphazard generalization certainly leads to misinterpretation of diverging concepts, for these terms are not referring to the same epistemic process in recognizing reality. So mirroring, for example, pratibimba, does not just describe the mirroring of the external in the mind, as it also stands for the process of assuming the manifold and maintaining externality. The metaphor here explains that, just as in each and every account of mirroring, the same entity is perceived as many and the mirror image transcends what it is mirroring, every mode of manifestation stands uniquely as if isolated from its singular source, the base consciousness. Consciousness in this paradigm has the challenge of escaping its singularity and projecting something to be external and something to be different. And the mirror metaphor is exclusively used for this purpose and not to reject the modes of manifestation as in Advaita or to reject its basis as found in Yogacara. The same applies to the concept of manifestation, abhasa. Recognition, pratyavigyana, along these lines is an epistemic process of grounding absolute consciousness in every single mode of its manifestation and not just describing a non-temporal self. In the act of recognition, the subject does not confront a merely external entity but rather blends this consciousness within what is primordially given in the pre-judgmental state, which is the very self-mirroring consciousness attaining the manifold, manifesting as subject and object. In this account, memory is not just woven in the fabric of consciousness, as is the case of judgmental consciousness, but it is presented in the form of memory blended with the very presentation of immediate consciousness. Crucial to Abhinavaguptian epistemology is the concept of freedom, swatantra, as I mentioned earlier, that goes beyond explaining cosmogenesis and describing individuation into subjectivity, embodiment, and everyday mode of consciousness. The freedom inherent to Shiva or pure consciousness, including the delimited modes of consciousness as encountered in everyday experience, also grounds difference and relation, central epistemic issues to bridge the chiasm between the subject and objective poles. Metaphysically, this describes the freedom of Shiva, or the freedom inherent to pure consciousness that constitutes absolute subjectivity, which is Shiva himself, that gives rise to the manifold. Epistemically, the same consciousness, even in its individuated state, performs the same acts of creation and dissolution, giving rise to the sense of externality and difference, maintaining the distinctness of entities as they are constituted or given to consciousness, and eventually dissolving difference in the very foundational consciousness. Given that this concept of freedom metaphysically underscores a shift from an earlier paradigm of stasis when it attributes dynamism to the absolute or the self, and also that subjectivity and sentience define the inherent freedom within the absolute, the epistemic issues such as the plasticity of consciousness are simultaneously resolved to manifest in myriad forms, as in imagination, an error, or in everyday consciousness, all directed towards other subjects and objects. This concept of freedom likewise grasps the subjectivity of other subjects as well as recognizing objects as objects, maintaining difference at the phenomenal level while also stressing on absolute homogeneity. Embedded within the concept of freedom is also the idea of intentionality, or of consciousness being directed towards something external. At the heart of this argument lies the thesis of pratyabhijna, or recognition, that underscores the atemporal nature of reflexive consciousness that is inherently autonomous. But this confirmation does not stand in negation of what manifests as temporal, the finality of past entities given to recognition and the contemporaneity of immediate experience. In other words, temporal expression of consciousness remains unassailed, making everyday life to be intrinsically woven within the absolute. The concept of freedom in this paradigm underscores a shift from life as suffering to sport, rather than the world being a miserable trap being repeatedly reproduced and relived according to mental imprint and mental traces that one should escape at all costs. The world in this altered paradigm becomes a playful expression of the absolute self, and the manifold becomes an artistic expression of the singular reality. And indeed, playfulness appears deeply embedded within the inherent nature of sentient beings, and the struggles and pains occurring during these playful activities appear trivial. Malini Vijayottara in Tantra introduces threefold means. So the samavesha, for the samavesha, the upaya, the entry into Shiva or pure consciousness, the sought after altered state of consciousness that transforms limited gaze, and the course involves like Veda, penetration from the lower to the higher states of consciousness, or the surge of Kundalini from the lower to the higher. And then the second, the experience is described as sudden, hatha, intermingling, or three harmony, samarasya, referring to the coupled Yamala state of Shiva and Shakti principles. The state described in graphically embodied terms is means to an end of ending bondage that Abhinava describes in terms of the bondage of the mind, Bauddha, and the bondage of individuality, Pomsna. Rather than self-realization being a sudden and single-step process, this paradigm underscores it as a cumulative process wherein our bodily instincts and habits are inversed through external means, mental constructs are corrected, and proper vision is developed through analytical process. And eventually, pure will is generated to invert the gaze from a determined and limited individuality to the pure being of boundless consciousness described in terms of universal bliss. That's Jagadananda. The threefold means of absorption are directed towards cultivating proper will, Ichha, refining the cognitive process by means of developing analytical process that allows the mind to grasp the entire epistemic process or grasping objects, jnana, and recognizing embodied states as pure expression of being and consciousness and transforming bodily being into Shiva consciousness. While at times these threefold means based on volition, cognition and action can be applied simultaneously or successively, it also appears that any of these means in isolation suffices to grant liberation. And that how does this happen and how are these upayas applied, or when someone starts applying to these upayas, the concept converges with another concept. This is where the concept of absorption is intertwined with that of the emission of powers by Shiva, Shaktipata, that how the Lord Shiva's will manifests in my will of my own liberation. Moving beyond volition, philosophical discussion, epistemology in particular, becomes part of the Shakta Upaya because we are refining our thoughts by meticulous analysis of object-directed consciousness and its retrieval to its primordial ground. Even this refinement by means of discursive thought rests on the emission of power, Shakti. If the will of Shiva or the Absolute is to reveal his absolute nature, the refinement takes a proper course and one uses reasoning, tarka, the highest among the limbs of yoga, for turning the gaze inward from the external, that is when it surges. And then I need to stress more that all these means are identified not to discover something new or create something that didn't exist before. The process is through and through a process of rediscovery of what is already there by means of the refined thoughts only to go to our own intrinsic nature, Shobhava, that is Shiva or pure consciousness, and that our actions and our practices are just to provide that insight, and that is what is called liberation. While being in the world and actively engaging and enjoying the world, there can be this self-realized Jivan Mukta. And the self-realized is not an isolated from the body or the world. This self is constantly engaging. The world, therefore, in essence, the philosophy of Abhinavagupta uniquely places itself in contrast to various forms of dualism and subjective illusionism. He demonstrates openness to embrace ideas from all fronts, but at the same time critique the arguments that he deems unwholesome. Abhinavagupta succeeds in providing philosophical framework for the agamic rituals. Accordingly, the philosophy exceptionally embraces emotions and embodied experience as part and parcel of the absolute, and viewed being in the world, savoring worldly pleasure, as not counterintuitive to self-realization. He even considers that painful experiences have the same essential Shiva nature, and engages with that painful experiences and all world through savoring sensory bliss as integral to the totality of our being, because totality cannot exclude even the negative experiences. If there is poetry in his philosophical presentation, there is deep philosophical underpinning in his poetic expression. If he gives a rigorous analysis of mysticism, he mystifies some of the most apparent practices. Resting on all-encompassing foundation, Abhinava argues for the sameness of all philosophies and all means of realization and all substances, and above all, the sameness of all beings of all conditions. But the final words on Abhinava's philosophy rest both on the centrality of freedom in his metaphysics and the concept of inherent dynamism within the absolute that makes creativity and novelty possible in every level, be it phenomenal or absolute. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed this particular lecture, of course, and if there are any questions from the audience members or from the panelists, I'd be happy to pass it on to Sthaneshwarji, and we'll make sure that you are responded to.